Chapter 1. Introduction. This book sets out to tear up and rewrite energy history. Recorded history and local tradition have combined to give us the fossil-based culture we now have. A new, sustainable culture has to be created if we are to leave a planet suitable for habitation by our children and grandchildren. This transition means moving from fossil fuel-produced energy to non-fossil sources, which predominantly means wind and solar. Consequently, the future of energy supply will be almost entirely electricity. This involves generating green electricity where the resources are readily available. As a result, a most significant change in energy supply will be moving from a national supply situation, which all European states currently use, to a continent-wide electricity system based on a common but distributed energy supply. In this book, we face up to the challenge of fully defossilizing our energy systems. Fossil fuels have been the mainstay of energy provision for hundreds of years. The task is a great and challenging one. 8 billion people rely on fossils for their energy currently, but moving in a swift and orderly fashion to a fossil fuel-free system is the urgent challenge of our time. History records that Europe imports most of its energy. It is vulnerable to perturbations in the supply of this energy. Oil price perturbations in 1973 and again in 1981 caused inflation, recession, mass unemployment, and destruction of people's happiness. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Because Europe had become dependent on oil, coal, and gas from Russia, and because we in Western Europe empathized with our Ukrainian sisters and brothers, we were faced with the painful need to pressurize Russia, and we decided to cease buying their energy exports. We in Europe made a collective decision to refuse to buy Russia's main export, fossil fuels, payments for which would be used to finance the war effort in Ukraine. In April 2022, Russia cut off gas supplies to Poland and Bulgaria, reinforcing the need to make Europe less dependent on imported energy sources. Energy security is a clear imperative. In this book, we examine how the supergrid enables optimal indigenous clean resources for the European continent to achieve permanent energy security. Regional competitiveness is another imperative. As highlighted in the Draghi report, published as this second edition went to print, fossil gas prices in Europe were elevated for an extended period from 2021 to early 2023 due to the fallout from Russian aggression and COVID global supply chain impacts. At time of writing in September 2024, average gas prices in Europe are still significantly above the 5-year average 2015 to 2020. When wholesale electricity prices are largely dependent on gas price, this presents a competitiveness problem across the region. In his report to Commission President von der Leyen on the future of European competitiveness, former European Central Bank President Mario Draghi asserts as his starting point that energy is a key driver of the European Union's competitiveness gap vis-à-vis other world regions. He highlights the need to limit the impact of natural gas on electricity prices and suggests decoupling the price of renewables from fossil fuel generation by awarding long-term contract to renewables. This second edition has also been expanded to reflect on the emerging dynamics in other major regions such as China, India, and the US. The main reason why fossil fuel burning has to cease, however, is the environmental imperative. The damage being done by fossil burning is leading to global warming and radical changes in our climate. CO2 levels in the atmosphere have gone from a historic 270 parts per million, ppm, during the Industrial Revolution to 427 ppm by June 2024, an increase of 58%. Due to its heat-trapping ability, the content of water vapour in the atmosphere further amplifies the warming effect because warmer air holds more moisture than cooler air. As temperatures increase with increased greenhouse gas concentrations, the amount of water vapour also rises. It has increased by 4%, and like CO2, it is a powerful greenhouse gas. By burning fossil fuels, we are causing energy arriving from the sun to be trapped in the atmosphere. This increase in energy is the equivalent of releasing the energy of 4 Hiroshima atomic bombs into the atmosphere every second. Devastating fires, desertification, greater numbers of and more violent hurricanes and typhoons, rising sea levels, and displacement of populations are just some of the disasters that ensue from putting 40.8 trillion extra tons of energy-related CO2 equivalents, mainly the greenhouse gas CO2, into the atmosphere every year. An important distinction is to be made between CO2 and CO2e, the latter of which refers to the quantity of greenhouse gas expressed as CO2 equivalent. This is because there are many more greenhouse gases, GHGs, than just CO2, methane, refrigerants, etc. They differ in their ability to absorb energy and how long they stay in the atmosphere, and so have different global warming potentials, GWPs. To make the comparisons somewhat more digestible, CO2, by definition, has a GWP of 1. The other greenhouse gases have other GWPs and are all expressed in CO2 equivalents, or CO2e. For example, methane has a GWP of 28 over 100 years. Over 20 years, methane is 84 times more potent than CO2. From the Stern Review 2006 to new research published in 2024, models of the economic cost of climate change all estimate significant average world per capita losses to GDP, each more costly than the mitigation. The Swiss Re Institute 2021 shows a loss of global economic output relative to a world without climate change of 11% to 14% by mid-century, for warming of 2 degrees Celsius to 2.6 degrees Celsius. The global GDP was in the order of $93 trillion in 2021. A fourth, and arguably more acute and urgent reason to end our addiction to fossil fuels, or burning stuff for energy, is the public health imperative. In 2019, 55.4 million people died worldwide. According to a report from Jacobson et al., air pollution contributed about 7 million, 12.6%, of the deaths, making it the second leading cause of death after heart disease. Of the air pollution deaths, 4.4 million were due to outdoor pollution, and 2.6 million were due to indoor pollution. Similarly, a figure of 8 million deaths was cited in a study led by Harvard University on the number of deaths caused by burning fossil fuels in 2018. Indoor air pollution arises because 2.6 billion people lack access to clean and modern cooking fuels and technology, and therefore need to burn fuels for cooking and heating indoors. The deaths and illnesses arise when air pollution particles, mostly, and gases, trigger or exacerbate heart disease, stroke, chronic obstruction pulmonary disease, chronic bronchitis and emphysema, a lower respiratory tract infection, lung cancer, and asthma. According to Jacobson et al., 90 to 95% of air pollution deaths are caused by anthropogenic air pollution, caused by humans burning stuff. All this can cease when we electrify our systems for cooking, space heating, and transport, replacing fossil fuel sources with clean, price-stable, renewable energy. And what's more, an electrified energy system is significantly more efficient. As the Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, outline in their paper Energy After Fire, the shift from primitive heat to modern work, as we transition from fossil fuels to renewables and electric clean tech, our energy system is set to nearly double in primary to useful energy efficiency. This is driven by the fundamental physics of heat and work. Electrification is the efficiency-first principle in practice. Race to the future. We are in a race to the future, in a one-off transition to sustainability in energy supply. It is a race because there is growing evidence tipping points are being reached in environmental degradation, which could hasten global catastrophe. Already the floating Arctic ice cap is gone in summer. There is a vast amount of methane locked up in the permafrost of the Canadian and Siberian tundra. Locked up in the permafrost is 1.8 trillion tonnes of carbon, much of it as methane. Methane is a more short-lived greenhouse gas than CO2, but it is 30 to 80 times more effective at capturing radiant energy than CO2, depending on the timescale over which measurements are taken. The Earth's global average temperature reached or exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial era every month between July 2023 and June 2024, suggesting that the key Paris Agreement target may soon be beyond reach. Indeed, many climate scientists are increasingly of the view that the other main Paris target of keeping the rise to within 2 degrees Celsius will be impossible this century, without delivery of net zero emissions by mid-century, if not sooner. Looked at objectively, if the political rancour inserted by big oil and gas is allowed to continue, the climate target of well below a 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature set in Paris in 2015 will be impossible to meet. An atomic-powered Humvee is being driven through this target. We will show in this book that Europe needs to install at least 1,000 gigawatts, GW, of solar, 750 gigawatts of offshore wind, and 450 gigawatts of onshore wind to decarbonise Europe's energy supply by 2050. With more recent ENTSO-E scenarios published in 2024, suggesting up to 2,193 gigawatts solar, 811 gigawatts offshore wind, and 883 gigawatts onshore wind. Reflecting energy demand from users, such as the UK and Norway, is necessary to get a more complete picture of the European energy system. Other assumptions have been debated and remain unchanged in this second edition, e.g., a capacity factor of 60% from offshore wind may appear ambitious, but it reflects our confidence in the ongoing pace of technological innovation, evidenced all around. Artificial intelligence tools such as ChatGPT exploded into public life 1 year ago. According to the World Economic Forum, these systems require 33 times more energy to complete a task than task-specific software typically would. Although further technological enhancements will no doubt make AI processes more energy efficient, AI is a factor driving the need for greater data center capacity, placing increased pressure on the electricity grid. Total electricity demand has remained flat in most OECD countries for the last 15 years, but we are now at an inflection point. Before considering the impact of AI, which will require more sophisticated modelling, the electricity demand modelling referenced in this book identifies the need for over 800 megawatts, MW, of new wind power generation capacity to be installed each week between 2022 and 2050. In 2021, there were 327 megawatts installed weekly, rising slightly to 352 megawatts per week by 2023. In its 2024 to 2030 Outlook report, Wind Europe states, "We expect Europe to install 260 gigawatts of new wind power capacity over 2024 to 2030. The EU 27 should install 200 gigawatts of this, 29 gigawatts a year on average. That's a significant improvement to a 558 megawatt per week, but still not enough." They go on to say, to meet its 2030 climate and energy targets, the EU now needs to build 33 gigawatts a year on average. The ambition stated is still about 20% lower than what we and ENTSO-E suggest is needed. Yet even at that, Wind Europe's outlook is pessimistic. We therefore expect the EU to fall around 30 gigawatts short of its 425 gigawatt ambition needed to meet the 42.5% renewable energy target. Even before accounting for AI, none of the actual projected or target EU ambition stacks up with the demand modelled for a fully decarbonised economy. Meanwhile, China has, according to many analysts, already met its 2030 targets, nearly 6 years early, transforming its economy in the process. While the West turned away from running toward where the ball will be with industrial policies, choosing instead to chase the ball on its volatile journey through the markets, China has instead built the green technology manufacturing capacity the world needs. It has scaled its battery, wind turbine, solar, transmission, power management, and electric vehicle industries through its massive domestic market, assuring that they have the critical materials and geographic clustering necessary to succeed. Europe urgently needs to improve our ability to deliver at speed to address each of the 4 imperatives of energy security, competitiveness, environment, and public health. This includes the planning and permitting process and strengthening its wind energy supply chain. As Chapter 12, The Market for Energy, sets out, the West has not moved its energy markets to enable the future, but instead forced renewables to compete on a playing field designed for fossil fuels. This has caused significant challenges for Western wind turbine manufacturers, ones felt to a much lesser degree by Chinese firms. In most countries around the world, current energy market designs do not incentivize investment in new renewable energy generation or battery storage capacity at anything like the speed and scale required to stay within the physical limits of a 1.5-degree world. Instead of fixing the root causes of lack of Western wind turbine manufacturer and electric vehicle financial sustainability or competitiveness, the West's position broadly tends towards punishing China for its strategic focus on building the manufacturing capacity the world needs. This is a short-sighted strategy. It will lead to Western manufacturers being increasingly restricted only to domestic markets, leaving the entire world as China's market. No other countries are going to pay Western premiums for green products of equal and even inferior quality. While not the focus of this book, the excessive tariffs that expose the West to quite reasonable counter-tariffs in other parts of the West's economy and make its green products globally uncompetitive are things we are certain Eddie would counsel against. In Chapter 12, we diagnose the problems and propose principles for fit-for-purpose markets based on decades of experience as purpose-driven investors and practitioners in the renewable energy sector. Radical market reforms, designing from first principles to support the decarbonised economy we desire, must now be a priority, along with a holistic, all-of-government approach to decarbonisation as the North Star, encompassing economic, industrial, energy and climate policy. When the various EU member governments and the institutions of the EU come together to decide on action to combat climate catastrophe, they travel down one blind alley after another. They placed their trust in carbon capture and storage for the past 30 years, and as yet there is no commercial product for sale. Natural gas comes next. With a decree called a Delegated Act, the European Commission has decided that natural gas is sustainable, and in so saying they put a huge credibility issue at the heart of their newly adopted taxonomy proposals. The granddaddy of all the machinations of the fossil fuel industry can be seen with the proposals for hydrogen. Hydrogen is the darling child of the oil and gas industry. We expand fully on this topic in Chapter 10 and present a summary of the solutions with high merit in Chapter 13. There are clear arguments for accelerating near-term emissions reduction solutions while planning and enabling the major infrastructure, adoption of innovative grid technologies, and deep market reforms proposed in this book. We certainly do not advocate neglecting one in favour of the other. An interesting concept is the time value of carbon, TVC. The idea of applying a carbon discount rate to incentivise urgency of emission-reducing actions. In a world where environmental, social and governance, ESG reporting, has become an industry, one sometimes wonders if materiality and clarity of purpose is at risk of being lost in the detail. TVC may be useful to create meaningful metrics to help policymakers and investors prioritise flows of capital for measurable impact with the required urgency. Electrify nearly everything. Electricity supplies between 20% and 25% of global energy requirements at present, depending on the country. In Chapter 2, we examine the history of electricity and its evolution to where it performs almost any energy-related task. It can be manufactured from many sources. All historical methods of generating electricity, with the exception of hydropower, use heat engines of one type or another. Wind and solar PV have no need of heat, as they harvest energy directly from wind and sun. With our sun's projected remaining lifespan of 4 billion years, continuity of energy supply is assured. This allows these primary energy sources to be the bedrock of sustainable energy. Transport accounts for some 30% of global energy use. The world is in full throttle mode to have all road vehicles powered by electricity. In place of the internal combustion engine, an electric motor supplied by a battery provides the energy to drive the vehicle. Electrical vehicles, EVs, work brilliantly, They are a joy to drive. They are clean and quiet, with fewer moving parts and therefore maintenance. EVs are incredibly efficient, converting over 90% of electrical energy to mechanical energy, compared to only 30% fuel efficiency in an internal combustion engine, ICE, vehicle. We believe electricity will not only power private cars, but will power lorries and heavy goods vehicles as well. Hundreds of companies are vying with one another to come up with the optimum charging system. By Eddy's estimate, 10,000 charging stations around Europe could keep the fleet of commercial and heavy goods vehicles fueled for what will probably be autonomous driving. Heat pumps can accomplish space heating using electricity and do it highly efficiently. 100 units of electricity used to drive a heat pump will deliver between 300 and 500 units of low-grade heat to warm premises. Arc furnaces and other technologies are proving that electrification of industrial heat, including at very high temperatures, is technically feasible today. It is commercially viable in many cases in the US, and fiscal policy to rebalance incentives where there is a spark gap can remove a key barrier to adoption. Almost everything that needs energy can be supplied by electricity. The limited exceptions, which are explored in Chapter 10, can be supplied by hydrogen or some hydrogen-containing compound, such as ammonia. In 2022, 93 million tonnes of hydrogen was produced, and the majority was used as an industrial process feedstock, all generated from fossils, natural gas. At present usage, this industry causes emissions of 830 million tonnes per annum of CO2. Iron ore smelting, which currently uses coking coal, may rely somewhat on hydrogen and be completely converted to green steel by 2050. This, along with demand from certain other industries, less the 33% of today's hydrogen, which is used for oil refining, would give rise to the need for anything from 90 million to 400 million tonnes of hydrogen annually by 2050, according to analysts cited in Chapter 10. Location, location, location. The energy sources of the future are available in the wind and solar energy that naturally happens. Over the past 30 years, wind turbines have been evolving from small curiosities to mini power stations. The standard offshore turbine is now 16 megawatts. The cost of wind-generated electricity is circa half the cost of fossil-fired, and nuclear generation on sites with good wind speeds, 9 metres per second plus. The fuel is free, and so the cost of power generated over a project's lifetime is known before it is constructed. This characteristic, unique to renewable energy, makes it a valuable instrument for price stability, and all the benefits of that certainty for businesses and households. Solar photovoltaic, PV, is one of the extraordinarily successful stories of the past 13 years. The price has fallen by 90% in this time. In sunny places like Abu Dhabi, Chile, and southern Spain, before the rise in interest rates, it was possible to generate electricity at circa €0.015 per kilowatt hour. Globally, in 2024, the range is €0.027 to €0.054, depending on the quality of the solar resource, other location-based factors, financing costs, etc. Optimizing the cost of generation is primarily about three things: location, the quality of the resource, and site-specific costs to build and operate, the cost of finance, and risks to expected revenues. Any circumstance or event that is not within the control of the asset owner, but for which the owner has financial responsibility. With energy generation and delivery needed to move to an all-electricity solution, this in turn means that generation of electricity needs to happen where the resources exist. The question is, where are these sustainable resources to be found? In Europe, offshore wind will provide the bulk of the continent's energy. Winds in northern Europe combined with sun, which can be harnessed everywhere, but most effectively around the Mediterranean basin, where the intensity of radiation is highest. These two areas alone are well capable of supplying all the energy we need. Not only are expensive fossil fuels replaced, but the new energy sources come in eternal abundance, free of charge, and are therefore the only real path to deliver energy independence. Of all the countries in the EU, Ireland has by far the greatest offshore energy resource. This follows from its isolated island position in the North Atlantic. Ireland can supply as much of Europe's electricity as it wishes to. So far, the Irish government has suggested that circa 30 gigawatts of floating offshore wind will be built off the west coast before 2050, in addition to the 7 gigawatts conventional offshore wind it wants installed before 2030 in the seas around Ireland. Floating technology is needed, and this will be fully commercial from the early to mid-2030s onwards. The word suggested is used because that is the extent of the planning that has been done to implement this programme. Every other European country with a maritime aspect is far ahead of Ireland in the exploitation of its offshore resource. Since my former company, Airtricity, built the Arklow banks 20 years ago, no new offshore wind turbine has been placed in Irish waters. In the intervening period, the companies I founded, Airtricity and Mainstream, have developed 4,100 megawatts in the UK North Sea. Ireland should be the Norway of renewable energy. Exploitation of the floating offshore resource could change the dismal history of Ireland's western periphery. Later, we examine the history of the west of Ireland over the past 3 centuries, from penal law times Connacht, and western seaboard countries were turned into hell's waiting room for the native population. The West can be truly awake and become the sustainable engine for economic growth in Ireland for centuries to come. The western part of Ireland has a source of energy which bestows on it great comparative advantage, enormous wind speeds over the seas. From Galway upwards, average annual wind speeds of 12 metres per second are to be had. This will give a capacity factor of 65%. In short, how much is delivered across the years versus the maximum that could be delivered by the turbines at full output, which compares very favourably with the average of 28% so far achieved by the 4.3 gigawatts of onshore wind farms in Ireland. Great prosperity can be assured for the foreseeable future if the Irish government and the EU can turn the comparative advantage of these western high wind speeds into competitive advantage for Ireland, for Irish companies, but more especially for the communities that live along the western seaboard. According to the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, and Global Wind Energy Council, GWEC, and others, for every megawatt of wind power installed in the sea, 16 to 17 person-years of work are created. Thus, say if 30 gigawatts were built, then almost 500,000 person-years of work would ensue. Put another way, 10,000 full-time jobs are the opportunity in Ireland alone, along with all the savings in cost, climate catastrophes averted, and energy independence benefits. While we focus on Ireland as a case study, and make the case for its particular advantage, there are parallels in the economic history for a number of other coastal regions in Europe that enjoy comparable opportunities for reinvention as floating offshore wind development zones for export to wider European markets. The problem with renewables and the solution. The favourite attack by the fossil fuel industry on renewables has been wind and solar's unreliability. Fossils can be burned in whatever quantity is needed to meet customer demand, in any weather, for as long as fuel can be supplied. In contrast, energy can be harvested from wind only when the wind speed is high enough. Solar is genuinely intermittent, as no electricity can be generated at night. In this book, we delve deeply into the complementarity of the two sources of generation, and how the variability of wind and the intermittency of solar can be mitigated. The wind is always blowing somewhere. If a grid which collects the wind were wide enough, then the wind that is variable locally would be turned into a source of firm power. It was this realization that led me to formulate the supergrid concept in 2001. Deploying a supergrid for storms tracking across Europe, much of the variability of wind could be mitigated. At the time of formulating the supergrid concept in 2001, solar PV was too expensive to be considered as part of a genuine solution to decarbonisation. But now, solar power is helping to supercharge the energy transition. Solar photovoltaic costs have fallen by 90% over the past decade. This is matched by the cost of battery technology, which has experienced a similar curve. Battery storage technology is recently starting to have an impact in smoothing out the daily variability from sources of renewables, particularly solar. In California, when the sun goes down, solar is replaced by gas to meet demand. For the first time on April 16, 2024, batteries were a larger source of power than gas on the grid in the early evening. The cost of clean energy from onshore wind has reduced by 70% over the same period as solar energy costs fell by 90%, explained by the higher levels of modularity in the latter. This may lead some to argue against the development of offshore wind at scale, or investment in the supergrid, now that battery storage is becoming more effective. Following this train of thought would be folly of the highest order. Apart from its low cost, solar PV complements wind generation because the availability of the two resources is almost perfectly complementary, in particular on a seasonal basis. As Jenny Chase emphasises, there is no way we can build enough battery to shift energy from summer to winter. But wind and solar generation in Europe complement one another. When wind generation is high, in winter, when we need heat, solar generation is low. When wind generation is low, in summer, solar is at its peak contribution. A large grid capturing the wind energy from the 200 storms that arrive over Ireland each year, combined with the solar that comes from the Mediterranean area, goes a long way towards firming renewable energy and mitigating variability. This supergrid has many of the attributions of the current onshore transmission grids. It is meshed, therefore reliable. There are multiple pathways to supply the customer should any one cable route fail. The supergrid works in harmony with existing national transmission systems. It connects with them seamlessly. Thus, southern Germany, Czechia, Italy and Spain, for instance, could be supplied with wind-generated electricity from Irish waters, and Ireland would be supplied with abundant and affordable solar energy from Portugal, Spain and Greece, in between the storms. It is a truism to say that without the supergrid, there can be no decarbonisation. Wind energy on land has low capacity factors and is saturated in most countries. Alongside this, community resistance to wind turbines in the local environment has increased greatly, even in Germany. No one technology can do it all. We need to develop offshore resources. As space for planning and development, onshore is an increasingly precious commodity. The ability of the supergrid to transmit vast amounts of power quickly to where it is most needed offers an unrivaled solution to the problem of seasonal variability that prevails. How to deliver the supergrid. How to build the supergrid has occupied much of my time over the past 20 years. I tried to interest the main players: grid system operators, electrical equipment manufacturers, developers, consultants, etc., by setting up the Friends of the Supergrid in 2009. This venture failed for two reasons. It proved too difficult for them to think beyond their national boundaries, and the technology to build the supergrid didn't exist. I addressed this technology question in 2018 by setting up the company Supernode. Supernode is designing new high-capacity subsea and terrestrial transmission cable technology based on superconductivity. This, together with other innovative grid technologies such as dynamic line rating, advanced power flow control, storage, and advanced conductors, are needed to deliver the capacity of electricity transmission to fully decarbonise our economies at the speed and scale that climate science asserts is required. These could increase overall network capacity by up to 40%, according to recent studies referenced by Mario Draghi in his competitiveness report. It is ironic that the fastest-moving product in the world, electricity, is the one that does not move freely from country to country in the EU. To allow the supergrid to be built, this situation has to change. Rules and regulations have to be brought forward in the institutions of the EU to create a Europe-wide system of electricity generation and transmission. In his April 2024 report to EU heads of state, former Italian Prime Minister Enrico Letta suggests the creation of a Clean Energy Delivery Agency. In Chapter 5, we propose in some detail how this can be accomplished for electricity transmission, using a Europe-wide Independent System Operator, EISO, and provide principles for a common electricity market, designed from first principles to suit and incentivise delivery of the energy of the future. Chapter 12. In his September 2024 report to European Commission President von der Leyen, Mario Draghi proposes to establish a 28th regulatory regime for electricity interconnection. As we see it, a number of institutions are needed at European level. There is the aforementioned EISO. There has to be an EU regulatory body. This body would include an architect function, which would specify where the first and subsequent legs of the supergrid would run. Other functions within the regulatory office would run competitions to decide which company gets to build each leg of the supergrid. The regulator would have to have representatives from every European country on its supervisory board, as well as a professional executive. Both the EISO and the EU regulator would be independent bodies, which is to say they would not be involved in the ownership of any of the supergrid assets. This latter point would do away with any conflicts of interest arising from asset ownership. A model for how this relationship would work exists in the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO, system in the US and Canada. It works along with local transmission system operators, TSOs, to optimize electricity flows in 15 states from Manitoba to the Gulf of Mexico. It is entirely privately driven and established as an independent non-profit organisation. From a programme planning and delivery perspective, given the urgency, scale and capital requirements, it is imperative that this mega programme of mega projects avoid the iron law of project management. That mega projects are over budget, over time, under benefits, over and over again. To mitigate this, Oxford Global Projects suggest principles for successful mega project delivery in Chapter 5. No time to lose. The clock towards extinction is ticking faster, driven by unsustainable growth-obsessed economies, with fossil fuels still their predominant form of energy use. This is reflected in the remorseless rise in global greenhouse gas emissions. Meanwhile, annual UN climate negotiations, known as Conference of the Parties, COPs, keep coming up short on what is required, confirmed by persistent failure by states to decarbonise as promised. A global carbon budget encapsulates what is urgently required. It determines the input of CO2e to the atmosphere by emissions from human activities, balanced by output, storage, in the carbon reservoirs on land or in the ocean. It is the cumulative amount of emissions permitted over a period of time to keep within a certain temperature threshold. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's Global Assessment, known as AR6, published in August 2021, indicates the remaining carbon budget to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, the more demanding Paris Agreement target, set in 2015, was 400 billion tonnes of CO2. Science has since indicated the need to go for that target, rather than, say, 2 degrees Celsius, because of the toll the latter would inevitably take on our civilization. For an average country, its share of the global carbon budget will run out in less than 9 years. For a high-carbon polluting country such as Ireland, the UK, and most countries in Europe, its share of the budget will run out a lot sooner, reinforcing the need to rapidly phase out fossil fuels. The prize for staying within budget is quickly stabilising our climate at temperatures that make it possible to have a healthy, thriving future. The higher global temperatures rise past 1.5 degrees Celsius, the more a changing climate will pose enormous risks to our natural, agricultural, economic and social systems. And the more vulnerable we become to extreme weather events of increasing frequency and ferocity. Moreover, the more inevitable it will be that humanity experiences irreversible and increasingly catastrophic impacts because of human-induced global overheating. Seizing the moment. We have arrived at a critical moment in the history of humanity. It is a time when we must face up to a reckoning, the consequence of our impact as a civilization, without urgent, decisive course correction, on the only planet we have, is that it will no longer sustain the same civilization as we know it today. We already know that this is increasingly likely to occur in many places in our own lifetimes. Throughout history, civilizations have grown, flourished, and for reasons including local climate changes, have waned, been forced to migrate en masse, or even died out completely. The scientific evidence of the impact of the global climate crisis on our entire global ecosystem Our lands and seas, hospitable temperatures, the physical property providing shelter and livelihoods, the food and water systems which sustain us, our economies. Should we fail to stay within the physical limits of 1.5 degrees, is clearer and starker by the day. Everything we care about is under threat. So, in what remains of this critical decade, for a new term in office for our European Parliament, Council and Commission, along with many newly elected national governments, both in our region and around the world, we must make the changes to ensure emissions peak and then decline. We must set firmly in motion the master plans that will deliver the fully decarbonised economy, with clean air and the price stability we all desire before 2050. This is a mere 25 years to complete an unprecedented infrastructure programme and energy system change. A failure to do this would be disastrous. Rightfully, today's children and future generations would be far from forgiving. They would conclude that politicians, and policymakers in particular, did little to halt and force down the rising emissions curve due to a gross collective failure to respond in a timely way to scientific evidence. It would be easy to determine that those holding the pen knew what was happening to the planet, and yet allowed their pursuit of power, their carelessness, and their self-serving actions or base inertia to override considerations of how best to respond to an existential threat. Any overriding obsession with short-term controversies, allied to repeated taking of less difficult options, such as allowing energy monopolies to maintain their hold on countries while failing to innovate in the context of a global emergency, or adopt commercially available and competitive clean technologies sufficiently, will be adjudged an insidious form of climate denial. Political failure to intervene decisively would exacerbate the social polarisation which threatens our democracies, fuelled by misinformation and diminution of the standing of science. Electorates increasingly show strong desire for radical action in responding to the interlinked climate crisis and decline in nature, the need for energy security and price stability. This handbook is a guide to how this can be delivered. Uniquely, in this moment in history, we have most of the tools and know-how to make the required changes for our future, crucially without reducing well-being today. This book sets out the course for much of the remainder, solutions with high merit, as opposed to distracting time wasters, innovations in progress to supercharge the transition, market principles to support the investment needed for deployment at the speed and scale required, and a supergrid to connect it all together in time. The Manhattan Project during World War II, which ensured the US won the race to generate nuclear weapons, was an intensive process with understandably unreasonable deadlines, given the extent of geopolitical instability. It was a process reinforced by international collaboration with its allies and some of the world's most eminent scientists. Albert Einstein helped spark the Manhattan Project, but came to deeply regret his initial encouragement given the nuclear monster that emerged from it. To build a supergrid in Europe that serves all of its citizens with clean, secure, affordable and price-stable energy probably requires a similar degree of intensive collaboration at international level, with the same kind of timelines, backed by leading-edge research and innovation. But in this case, a successful outcome will be of unquestionable benefit to humanity and planet Earth. It is now clear that China and India are leading the world in building long-distance, multi-gigawatt HVDC overhead lines to enable renewable energy to flow from where it is generated to where it is needed, much faster than Europe, or indeed North America. Although home to the most interconnected power system and grid technology industry, Europe is currently lagging behind in deploying high-capacity grids. The good news is that an opportunity exists for Europe to regain much of the regional industrial competitiveness lost by pursuing the vision of a meshed direct current, super-efficient supergrid, enabled with superconductors, using a fraction of the critical raw materials consumed by copper and aluminium grids, as laid out in this book. Furthermore, deploying innovative grid technologies will materially increase the capacity of existing infrastructure, while significantly reducing the cost, time, and delivery risk of new grids during the next decade. But ambition needs to be scaled up beyond the current aspirations of the European Green Deal that have been bolstered by REPowerEU. This book is the encapsulation of a big idea. It is not an academic work on an obscure possibility of electrical engineering. It proposes a solution for the efficiency frontier of all objectives of the energy trifecta: clean, secure, affordable, price-stable power. It is an attempt to catalyse change at a transformational scale, while being mindful that, though the largest driver, cutting emissions alone will not put the planet on the right trajectory. But pursuing this path needs great courage and leadership from politicians, policymakers, and decision-makers of all persuasions. It requires relentless commitment from energy companies, both state and private, green investors, scientists, and engineers. It is a task beyond one country, beyond one company. It requires collective action in the best interests of all and the natural environment where we have our being. Now is the time. Chapter Key Points. 1. We are in a one-off race against time to ensure a green energy supply in Europe and elsewhere. 2. A decarbonised future is one where wind, solar, and hydro-generated electricity are the primary energy sources. Ultimately, it is free from fossil fuels. 3. The urgency of decoupling our energy systems from fossil fuels is driven by 4 imperatives: energy security, competitiveness, environment, and public health. 4. We have the renewable resources, money, and human capital to effect this transition, to deliver clean, secure, affordable energy for all. 5. Europe urgently needs to improve its ability to deliver at speed. Oil, coal, and gas energy sources need to be replaced by about 750 gigawatts of offshore wind, 450 gigawatts of onshore wind, and 1,000 gigawatts of solar by 2050, before accounting for AI. 6. Current electricity generation needs to increase by an order of 2 to 3 times to decarbonise. The rate of deployment is some 40 to 60% below what is required in Europe. Meanwhile, China appears to have reached its 2030 emissions targets 6 years early. Europe can catch up, with market reforms to incentivise investment at the speed and scale required. 7. Further pan-European modelling is needed beyond the EU 27 and to account for technology advancements in supply and demand sides, and the grid. 8. Some green electricity will be used to crack water, to create hydrogen for use as a chemical feedstock, and as a reducing agent for iron ore processing, and in a few other industries which are not amenable to electrification. But hydrogen will not be used to decarbonise heat or transport efficiently or economically. 9. Vast sums are being spent by the fossil fuel industry to delay the energy transition. Even before externalities, the cost of wind-generated electricity on sites with good wind speeds, 9 meters per second plus, is circa half the cost of fossil-fired and nuclear generation. Solar is cheaper still, and both are needed. 10. The most abundant and cost-effective wind and solar exist remote from the continental customer and need the supergrid to be transmitted. The supergrid will harmonise the seasonality of these complementary natural resources. 11. The supergrid is a meshed, mainly offshore set of cables, constructed using HVDC, superconducting materials, and other innovative grid technologies to superpower existing transmission and interconnection infrastructure. 12. Recent rapid advancements in rollout of long-distance HVDC networks across China and India leave Europe on the back foot. The supergrid, as envisioned, can do much to regain lost industrial competitiveness. 13. Delivering the supergrid in time and cost-effectively means integrating innovative grid technologies, including superconductivity, and applying mega-project planning principles to the whole pan-European programme, working from 2050 backwards. 14. There are clear arguments for accelerating other near-term emissions reduction solutions, while planning and enabling major infrastructure, including the supergrid, and implementing deep market reforms. 15. We have reached a critical moment in history, and an enormous opportunity for the current political term. We must seize the moment. The window is closing.